Where's Paula? I'll get it.
The signing out tables, will they be along here? This side of the, it says auditorium doors, does that mean these ones? Yeah.
Got the foyer doors.
So if they need to sign out early, where are the sign out sheets going?
Same place, I think. We need to leave early, please make sure you sign out south here. So. Yeah, I think we'll have them there.
Okay. Hope so.
Hopefully they're not signing. Yeah.
Oh, hang on, there's a white.
Yeah. Oh, so I'm handing over to you, Katrina.
Oh no,
Yes, we changed the
Okay.
order.
it's because of the camera was set up.
Oh.
So but then he put that right in the corner. He's using this one as well.
So back.
Oh, hang on, it needs to be here. What time are we starting? Is that okay?
It's 9:20 now.
No, why would they put that in the corner? And then we'll get Claire to come up and Susanna to come up. You go? Go?
Whoops.
This one here is for Nathan. He wanted a handheld. No, Vanessa will sing.
So we're using the microphone just to go in.
I don't know. This one, Nathan wanted this one.
Okay.
But we're using this one. So they'll just choose up. Are they going to turn this on? Oh, I feel like I have a whānau here.
You do.
I feel like I've got a whānau right behind me.
I'll stand next to you there, man.
Yeah, there you go. I used to do kia ora koutou.
Oh, I don't know if it's working.
See? Oh. All right. Kia ora koutou. No mai hara mai, welcome to CoLab 2022. If we can start off our day with our karakia and stay standing for our rangitoto waiata. So e tū whānau. E te whānau, whaia te mātauranga kia marama, kia whai take, nā mahi katoa, tū maia, tū kaha, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia tātou katoa. Toto te monga, wa te mata te moana, Ngāti pāwa te iwi e. Ko Pupuke te roto, e nei na kura o te Kāhui ako, e ngā iwi tēnā koutou. E ngā iwi Tēnā koutou. E noho whānau.
Brilliant whānau. Kia hora te malino, kia whakapapa pānau te moana. He huia rahi mā tātou e te rangi nei. Aoraha atu, aoraha mai, tātou a tātou katoa. Ko rangi tātou te moanga, ko wairau te awa, ko Pupuke te lautou, ko te awa nui o Paratu te moana. Ko Ngāti, ko te rana, tauku iwi, ko Movik, tauku hapu, ko Mawik, tauku whānau. No ko Tarangi, o ko Tapuna, no whanganui a tara ahau. He tumawaki ki te kiotion, and the vision that all of us here have a shared responsibility for the tamariki in our care. Please take this opportunity today. It's really up to you. We've done a great deal of organising behind in the background, but it's up to you to make the most of this. Introduce yourselves to people, start the networking process. It would be fantastic if this was the start of actually us visiting and seeing each other in each other's schools, being in each other's classrooms. Before we get started, I just want to hand over to Katrina, who's going to introduce our cross-school lead team. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Joe. All right. Kia ora koutou. Our ASL team, led by John Marwick, comprises of the following members who are recognisable today by our red lanyards if you need any help. So we have Susanna Tomaz from Westlake Girls, Nick Brown, Westlake Boys. Unfortunately, Johnny is not able to be with us today. We've got Ali Hemmings from Takapuna Intermediate, Paula Snowball from Milford Primary, Connie Igerson from Takapuna Primary, Claire Robinson from Forest Hill, Narau Armstrong from Milford, and myself, Katrina Hoskin from Sunningnook Primary School. So we support a team of 42 within school leads across our Kāhui ako, and I'll now hand over to Paula to introduce our primary and intermediate WSLs who are here with us today.
Thank you, Katrina. Morena, everyone. Our WSLs here today are recognisable by their blue lanyards that they are wearing, but I will ask them to please stand and give you a wave as I introduce them by school. So from Milford School, we have Beverly Smith, Eugenie Middleton and Scott Polkinghorn. From Sunnybray, we have Wendy Fraser, Eva Rodding and Viv Morley. Competition here. From Takapuna Primary, we have Vanessa Woodfield, Susan Hahn and Cara Shaw. Oh, I think I need to do Milford again. From Forest Hill School, we have Samantha Ness and Aaron Joyce. From Takapuna Normal Intermediate School, we have Brianna Winter, Rebecca Phillips, Moana Jardin Osborne. And from Warau Intermediate, we have Teresa Owe and Teresha Orr. Milford, would you like to stand again? I will now hand over to Ali, who's going to go through some housekeeping for the day.
Okay. Kia ora, Paula. Okay, so the unisex toilets, you'll find them at the back of the auditorium through the central door there. Thank you for signing in. Please can you return your name badges when you sign out at the end of session 5. Tables will be set out at the auditoriums along the side of the room. If you do need to leave early, please make sure that you sign out for health and safety reasons. If you could please keep your mask on during indoor sessions unless you're eating or drinking. Presenters may choose to present without masks. Morning tea will be provided at the back of the auditorium after this session. Eat My Lunch packs have been ordered for lunch according to your selected meal preference. If you did order a special meal, you will find a coloured sticker on your name tag to alert the catering team to this. Please only take what you ordered, as we do have colleagues with allergies. You are free to enjoy your lunch in the auditorium, the foyer and outside gardens, but please note that this break time will coincide with the Westlake Girls' lunchtime as well. If you could kindly dispose of all rubbish into the correct bins, emptying any scraps into the black bokashi bins, and all boxes to be flattened, please, and put into the recycle bins provided at the back of the auditorium as well. Please note that this is a normal school day for Westlake Girls, and they have been kind enough to allow us the use of spare classrooms. For this reason, we are limited on space, so please ensure that you attend the workshops that you signed up for, and thank you for being understanding should the workspace feel compact. There is a basic first aid kit available at the back of the auditorium, but in an emergency, we ask that you contact your nearest WSL or ASL, who will contact the reception area. In the unlikely event of a fire or other emergency, touch wood, please could you make your way to the covered courts on this side? Yes, by the main car park. Parking at TNIS, please can you move your car by 4:30 p.m. so that we can put the bollards up? And thank you. I'm going to hand over to Narelle to go through today's program.
Kia ora Ari and morena everyone. You should have received a copy of today's program. The link is available by QR code, and here is a brief outline of the day as well. Session 1 is our keynote speaker, Nathan Wallace, followed by morning tea in the auditorium. Session 2 are our wellbeing workshops run by outside agencies, and we would like to thank them for joining us today. The venues are listed in your program, and the rooms have been signposted. You're also welcome to ask any ASL or WSL for any assistance. They are all wearing lanyards. There is a 10-minute transition period between Session 2 and Session 3. Then in Session 3 is our Coherent Pathways workshops for the various curriculum areas. Please allow sufficient time to get to your next venue, and thank you for being on time for each of your sessions. Session 4 is our Collaborative Sessions workshop. Please could we ask that you be mindful of timekeeping here and of the noise level should you be sharing a space with other groups such as the hall, foyer and gallery areas. Thanks for your understanding of this. We will end the day back in the auditorium for our guest address by Paula George, after which we invite you to join us at Fantail and Turtle for a drink and mingle before the long weekend. Don't forget to pop your Find Someone card into the box after Session 4 on your way into the hall to have a chance at winning one of 5 drink vouchers from Fantail and Turtle. Thank you and enjoy the day. I'll now hand over to Claire to introduce Nathan Wallace.
Kia ora Narelle. No hai mari hari mai koutou. Welcome everyone. Well-being has been at the forefront of so many discussions, debates and policy making. We hear the buzzwords, gratitude, empathy, mindfulness, and phrases such as feel your feelings, set personal boundaries, ground yourself. But what do these buzzwords and phrases actually look like in practice? We have all the knowledge of well-being principles and practices, and that knowledge is widely accepted. But what do we actually do with the knowledge to help ourselves? And more importantly, how do we teach it to our tamariki? We all know what it is we should be doing, but are we doing it, or are we merely talking about it? We have so much scientific research and data to back up the importance of daily well-being practices, that we have actually moved past the personal preference stage of whether well-being is your thing or not. We now know, without a doubt, that the physiological and psychological benefits of well-being practices are not only real, but desperately needed for ourselves and for our tamariki. We have scientific evidence to show that unhelpful habits and thought patterns can be altered by the rewiring of your brain, making positive changes entirely possible with practice. So it gives me great pleasure in introducing someone who needs no introduction for his incredible work in neuroscience. He is well known for his talks about brain development and neuroplasticity, And we are incredibly grateful to have him with us today to share his expertise and research. Please put your hands together to welcome Nathan Wallace.
Thank you. Oh, thanks for that warm and enthusiastic welcome, everybody. Ko te me tuatahi, me mihi nui ki a papatūnako, i tākoto nei, me raki nui e tui honei. Kei te huri taku kanuhi ki te mana whenua o tēnei rohi, nā te pāo. Ka mihi nui ki a koutou. Nā kaiako, nā mātua, nā whaia, kei konei, tēnei rā, kia ora mō tō tautoko ki te kaupapa. So, we've got 1 hour, we want to talk about neuroplasticity, right? Who's heard me talk before? Cool, it's about a third of you. Okay, so for the rest of you, we're going to go at ADHD speed, right? That way, you're actually getting 3 hours worth of professional development in the next hour, right? So you're getting a good bang for buck. If you can't keep up, just let me know and I'll try and slow down, right? I'll give you the same helpful advice my teachers gave me. Try harder. No, that's, yeah, no. Neuroplasticity is a big topic, right? So I'm skipping my introduction because I think, I was a primary school teacher, then I was a child counsellor specialising in trauma. That's where I got to know about the brain. Then I was an early childhood teacher. I only did that for like 9 months because I worked out that's the hardest job I've ever had for the least money, the least no contact time. And then I was a university lecturer for about 15 years. So 9 months as an early childhood teacher, 15 years as a university lecturer. You could probably work out which one was easier, right? So I lectured in human development at Canterbury University, and then I was the lead neuroscience trainer for Brainwave. That's a national body that disseminates neuroscience. So there was 40 other presenters. My job to make sure they stayed up to date with the brain development research and disseminated it. Really, that's just a long way of saying, in varying roles, people have paid me to stay up to date with human development and specifically brain development research in the last 20 years. So I want to be your cheat sheet today, specifically about neuroplasticity. Right, you ready to launch into it? I know there's a lot of us, but you can wave your arm around and interrupt me if you really want to ask a question, right? Neuroplasticity, the actual word neuroplasticity originally comes from the word plasticine, because it's supposed to mean that your brain is pliable, that you can, when one part dies off, another part can take over. So plastic in itself is not very pliable. So the word was originally plasticine. It's just that the research community did not pick up very well on the word neuroplasticity, so somewhere along the way it got shortened to neuroplasticity. But just be anchored in the fact that it's about the fact that your brain is adaptable. Now, we know that you've always had some degree of neuroplasticity. As in, if someone has a stroke and they lose the ability to talk, can they ever learn to talk again? Yes, they can. That's neuroplasticity. So we always knew you had some neuroplasticity, but we thought basically you only had it in response to something like that, a brain trauma. We knew young children had neuroplasticity, and then we thought you only really had neuroplasticity if you had a brain trauma like a stroke. Where that really changed essentially in the literature was, it was with the London cab driver study. Quick show of hands, who's familiar with the London cab driver study? I'm not going to test you on it, just to see how many people have heard of it. It really hit the mainstream media because when you learn to drive one of those black cabs in London, you have to learn what they call the knowledge, which has like 25,000 street names in it. So what researchers did was current thinking was the part of your brain that does memory was called the hippocampus, all right? Researchers really like the hippocampus because size correlates with function. What that means is quite simply the larger your hippocampus is, the more memory you have. The smaller it is, the less memory you have. So size and function correlate. So the researchers, their proposal was get all these people that are about to learn 25,000 street names, brain scan them first and measure their hippocampus, get them to learn the 25,000 street names, and then measure their hippocampus afterwards. According to current theory at the time, it meant it should be exactly the same size because they don't have neuroplasticity, because they're not babies and they haven't had a stroke. So you can probably guess what the outcome was. After 6 months, and they brain scanned everybody that completed the knowledge and actually learnt the 25,000 street names, their hippocampus had grown. So that's when we moved from going, you don't only have neuroplasticity when you have a brain trauma, to going, you have neuroplasticity when you work the brain really, really, really hard, like 25,000 street names. To bring you up to date, then in the early 2000s, there was the motor cortex study. And that basically showed you don't have to work that hard and you don't have to wait that long. He didn't wait 6 months. He got people that couldn't play the piano, and that's your motor cortex. He taught them a simple 1-minute recital on the piano, and they only had to do it twice a day. He didn't wait 6 months, like I say. He come back after 2 weeks and measured their motor cortex again, and it entirely changed in just 2 weeks. So that's when we went from going, you only have neuroplasticity when you've got a brain tumor, when you've got a brain injury, to going, oh, you have neuroplasticity if you work it really, really, really hard, like 25,000 street names, to going, actually, neuroplasticity is a relatively normal, natural condition in the brain. You always have neuroplasticity. If you're alive, you've got some neuroplasticity. Now, so that's good news. We can adapt and change, a whole lot more than we previously thought. There are 4 things, however, that you put in your mouth that lower your neuroplasticity. So I'm going to give you the overall recipe today for what the research tells us is how we achieve neuroplasticity for our students and for ourselves. But to put it in context, there are 4 things you put in your mouth that lower your neuroplasticity. So if you've had a stroke, I'd reduce these 4 things. If you're going back to university, haven't written an essay for 10 years, I'd reduce these 4 things because you will learn faster, consolidate knowledge faster, the more neuroplasticity you've got. So the 4 things that we know for sure reduce your neuroplasticity are CATS. Think C-A-T-S, not actual cats. They don't do anything to you, right? I should have said that first. It's an anagram, right? So, that stands for caffeine, alcohol. I know, so some wails of disappointment there with the caffeine. Caffeine, alcohol, tobacco, and sugar. They're the 4 things that we know really reduce your neuroplasticity. Is there one of them that you think might be a whole lot worse than the other 3? Which one of those do you think is the worst for your neuroplasticity? Sugar? Alcohol? Let's do our own little action research. So you have to put your hand up once. You have to choose one of them, caffeine, alcohol, tobacco, or sugar, but you're only allowed to put your hand up once. Who thinks it's caffeine? Okay, about 5 to 7 of you. Who thinks it's alcohol? Okay, nearly half of you. Who thinks it's tobacco? A few less than caffeine, I think. Who thinks it's sugar? Yeah, probably slightly more than alcohol. Yeah, it is very definitely sugar. Sugar's way out the lead of being the one that does the most damage. I mean, I'm talking for adults. If you're a teenager, then alcohol probably damages your neuroplasticity as much. But for the adult brain, basically the reason that sugar is so... because if you put alcohol and sugar in a petri dish, alcohol is more corrosive. So why am I saying that sugar is more damaging to your brain? And it's really because of the way the nature... that this, in this case, the caffeine, interacts with your genome. So I'm just trying to get you to see that basically you have receptors in your brain that protect you from the damage from things like coffee and alcohol. So let's just choose alcohol. You have receptors in your brain to absorb the damaging effects of alcohol. That means your ancestors must have been having alcohol for thousands and thousands of years in order for you to have receptors for that, right? So when you drink the alcohol now, most of the damage is absorbed by those receptors. So if I get, say, a clone of myself, and the only difference with the clone is they've got no receptors for alcohol. Now, all humans have receptors for alcohol, but it's a thought experiment, just so you understand what the receptors do, right? So there's me, there's a clone, only difference is they've got no receptors. We both have 5 units of alcohol. Basically, 4 of those units are absorbed by my receptors. There's only 1 unit left to go through my bloodstream, through my heart, and to do damage. Whereas the person with no alcohol receptors, he drinks the same amount, 5 units, but all 5 units go through his bloodstream, all 5 units go through his heart, he gets 5 times as drunk, 5 times the negative effects. So these receptors really protect us from that damage. That means your ancestors thousands of years ago, a lot more of them did die of alcohol poisoning. Not that many people die of alcohol poisoning now. It's not a leading cause of death, but once upon a time it would have been. But fortunately for us, your ancestors persevered and just kept drinking anyway. So now, thousands of years later, we have receptors for those. You've got receptors for caffeine. You've got receptors for THC, for marijuana. So we've been having that for thousands of years. You do not have receptors for refined sugar. We've only had refined sugar since like Queen Elizabeth's day, which is, about 300 years or something, which is not enough time to evolve receptors to it. That's why most human beings die of heart disease. Because we just don't have receptors for refined sugar. Okay, so sugar is by far the worst one. We've got a short space of time, and I want to give you some real practical things that you can do in the classroom, but I don't want to make it overly simplistic either. So it doesn't just mean coffee's bad. You have to look at it in the dosage, you have to look at the age and stage of life. There's 2 major studies now that show heavy coffee drinkers, that's people who have 3 cups of coffee or more a day, over 65, have a 80% reduced chance of dementia. So that means drinking coffee and being a heavy coffee drinker after 65 is a very good idea. However, we can't just say coffee's bad. 17% of the population have an adaptation to coffee. They've got a genetic adaptation. They're the people that can drink 10 cups of coffee a day and still go to sleep at night. Who are those people? Hands up, who can do that? Yep. So that's only supposed to be 17% of the population, so some of you might just be in denial, because that seems like slightly more. But what I'm saying is we can't just, in the old days, we just went by body weight and we couldn't map your genome. So we didn't do individual. We just went for everybody. The first coffee's good for you, stimulates digestion. Second coffee's neutral. The third coffee's bad for everybody, because that's when your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, and these are the things associated with heart disease. But for that 17% of the population that have that adaptation, the 10th cup of coffee a day, their heart rate's not going up, their blood pressure doesn't go up. So for that 17%, coffee seems harmless. So I'm throwing that in to confuse you a little bit, just so you know we can't just make it simply coffee bad. It does depend on the stage of your life, it does depend on your own genome. But generally, it's going to reduce your neuroplasticity. So yeah, good idea for elderly people to drink coffee, bad idea for teenagers to drink coffee. Because they're at a stage of life when they're rapidly laying down myelin. We want lots of neuroplasticity in their brain. So to slow that down is really slowing down the biology of learning in the brain. Okay, that's just to give you a general context, all right? So you understand neuroplasticity. These 4 things we put in our mouth reduce it. Before I move into like the neurosequential model and giving you the model of different practice tips to put in the classroom, I just wanted to say in general, people underestimate how much neuroplasticity you've got. People in their language assume that we're much more rigid and stuck than what we are. Basically, over the last 150 years, we've been taught to think that the biology of your brain dictates how you think. Whereas what we understand now is how you think dictates the biology of your brain. So we're much more in charge than we previously thought. Okay, how are you going to harness neuroplasticity? Because I know you mentioned it in your introduction, that it used to be something that some teachers did, but now after things like COVID, we have such a high rate of kids that are showing basically trauma effects that it becomes necessary for everybody to do it. The Obama government, even before COVID though, invested billions of dollars in mindfulness. When we come on to that, because they worked out what you mentioned in your introduction, Claire, really, that were referred to, was that we used to think well-being was a warm, fluffy thing. That's nice if you've got some extra time, but get over that and get back to doing the exams. Whereas now we know how safe they feel, is how calm their brainstem is how much cortex they have. Social emotional well-being will directly result in higher academic grades. We'll talk about that, how the brain works. So yeah. Anyone that's heard me talk before will know that we usually start off with the neurosequential model. Because if I'm going to talk to you about practice and what you can do in the classroom, I'm going to tell you that you've got to go from the bottom of the brain to the top. It's called the neurosequential model. Neuro means brain, sequential means a sequence. So neurosequential is an academic way of saying brain order. And the brain order is the same for all human beings. It's bottom to top. So when I talk about brain number 4, it's this most recent one at the front. Brain number 1 is down the base. Basically, brains have evolved from the bottom to the top. So number 4 is the most recently evolved. Number 1's the first. They come online across your life, bottom to top. They work on a second-by-second basis, bottom to top, inside out. It's just a universal principle of brains. They work bottom to top. The brain, when we're talking about neuroplasticity, that we're really focusing on is what I'll call brain number 4, which is the front half of that blue brain that you're seeing in front of you. Right? So the whole blue thing is like a helmet that goes over top of brains 1, 2, and 3. All of that blue helmet is called the cortex. But it's really the front half of that cortex, the frontal cortex, that we're referring to as brain number 4, that you need to harness for neuroplasticity. The easiest way I can get parents to understand what brain number 4 does, because there's lots of information, so I don't want to fill up your working memory and overly confuse you with words like frontal cortex. So just get stuck on brain number 4 and understand that brains 1, 2, and 3, when I tell you what they are, you will work out that your dog has brains 1, 2, and 3. So that makes it nice and easy for you to work out what brain number 4 does, because it's essentially the brain you've got that your dog hasn't got. So it really is that simple. If you want to know if it functions in the frontal cortex, really the only question you have to memorize is, can the dog do it? Because it really is that simple. Because if you can do it and the dog can do it, then it's not in the frontal cortex, because he doesn't really have one. If you can do it and the dog can do it, it's brains 1, 2, and 3. Brain number 4 is exclusively the stuff you can do, the dog can't do. So does feeling happy have to be in brain number 4? No, you're asking because you know the dog can do that. So yeah, that must be brains 1, 2, or 3. What about reading? Does that have to be in brain number 4? So again, you're asking yourself, can the dog do it? And no. Everything on a school report is going to be in the frontal cortex, right? Because the dog's not going to do well at anything on a school report. So just think of the frontal cortex as being everything that makes you brainy, right? Or your higher intelligence. That's really only half of it though. The other half of the frontal cortex is it's everything that keeps you out of jail. Because the frontal cortex is also the home of empathy, understanding consequences. Importantly, it's the home of controlling your emotions. So basically, everything that makes you brainy, everything that keeps you out of jail, up there in that frontal cortex, right? When that's fully developed, you've reached adulthood. Because it goes from the bottom to the top, then when that's fully online, brain number 4, when you show that brain scan, you've reached adulthood. So how old are you on average when you reach adulthood? Obviously, everyone's got a different number, but we put everyone's results together. What's the average age you reach adulthood? Yeah, we only have to go back 20 years in the literature, and it says that you had an adult brain at the age of 10 to 12. Right? So clearly no one had lived with a 14-year-old back then, right? But the reason that they said that the brain was developed at 10 to 12 was because they didn't have brain scans, they just had tape measures. And if you're measuring someone's skull, it stops growing at the age of 10 to 12. It wasn't until we had brain scans you could see that, well, it might not grow after the age of 12, but it's certainly not online until much later than that. The literature sat for about 5 years saying early 20s was the average. Then the technology got better, the cohorts got larger, and now we've updated that to mid to late 20s. So mid to late 20s, what's that, 27.5? Now obviously that's an average. Your kid's not going to wake up when he's 27.5 and suddenly want to get a job and shower every day, right? That's doesn't come online like that. That's actually one of the criticisms of research, is that we do put everyone down to the same average number, and this average person doesn't really exist. I mean, 27.5 doesn't even take into account gender. If you put gender onto that, that's individual information. 27.5 no longer works, because basically one gender's brain grows quite substantially faster than the other gender. That means you will see one gender mature quite substantially faster than the other gender. So any guesses which gender that could possibly be? You don't want to break into work groups and nut that out for 20 minutes? Is there anyone that's thinking the male brain grows faster? No? Well done. Yeah, so we don't want to look at that. We don't want to look at that with a deficit lens, so I'm encouraging you to think of the male brain as being like a fine wine, right? But anyway, the females will typically show an adult brain scan between 18 and 24. That means even the females taking a long time to get to adulthood are generally there by 24. Yet I'm using 27 as the overall average, so clearly something's dragging that average up quite a lot. That can only be one thing, because the male brain, the typical time that you show an adult brain scan for a male is anywhere from 22 to 32. So men typically show an adult brain scan 22 to 32, women typically 18 to 24. The literature combines them together and talks about this imaginary average person with no gender who's 27, right? I want you to understand there's 1,000 different things that affect when the individual reaches adulthood. I'm just telling you the first 2 things you can measure in the numbers or the quantitative research. Number 1, girls' brains grow faster. Easy to find that in the research because you literally see it happening right in front of you, so it's quite easy to document. Next biggest impact on how quickly you reach your milestones is birth order. Haven't really done that today because we've only got an hour, but that's that first 1,000 days talk I usually do. Basically, the brain's designed to work out how brainy it needs to be for the rest of its life in the first 1,000 days. And the best data you can get is language from your primary caregiver. So the way I get parents to understand the importance of the first 1,000 days is to point out that it's your eldest child who's likely to be the richest and the highest qualified. Not just by a little bit, by quite a lot, right? So there you go, you might want to start being slightly nicer to that one now that you've got that piece of information, right? What's driving that? Statistically, so large is the gap between how much the eldest child earns and how much all the other kids earn, we don't even bother putting the other kids into separate categories. In neuroscience, it's really easy. There's only 2 birth orders. You're either a firstborn child or you're a not firstborn child. So why is everyone else just chucked in the not firstborn child category? And it's simply because there is no statistical difference on average between your children 2, 3, 4 and 5. On average, they grow up to be the same income bracket, the same qualification bracket. The big leap is between child number 1 and all of the other kids. Now, I should have said this is population data. That means what I'm saying is not true of every single individual family. It's true of a random population of 100. If I take 100 people off the street at random, measure their income and qualifications, their brothers and sisters' incomes and qualifications, you'll find the majority of the time the eldest child is the highest qualified and earns the most money. It's not every time, because if your eldest child becomes a teacher, bugger all chance they're going to be the richest in the family, right? So that skews it a bit. So that's why we have to use 100, so we can include the accountants and the CEOs and the lawyers and the higher paid professions. But yeah, it's a really large gap when we do the average. What's driving that is the extra language from the primary caregiver in the first year. I'm just putting it all into really the basics. You on average speak 20,000 words a day to your firstborn child in their first year of life, and you're on average speaking 15,000 words a day to all of the other kids. That's not rocket science, that's just because that's the only time you only had one kid. So yes, so if you like, your first child gathers 20,000 units of data of how intelligent they need to be, all the other kids are gathering 15,000 units. So that's really the main driver behind why eldest children go up to be the richest and the highest qualified. Firstborn children, not having to share their parent in that first year of life, that's a huge developmental advantage, speeds up their brain development. So when I said girls are 18 to 24, if you're a girl who's the firstborn child in the family, you're probably at the 18 end of the spectrum when you become an adult. They're the easiest students to teach because their brains are growing the fastest. They're the little girls that get to school that can have 5 and can already write their name and already know the colours and already know the numbers, and right? Because they've got all of that, they're firstborn girls. They learn all that pretty easy. If you're a girl who's not the firstborn, then you don't tend to struggle, but it takes you a little bit longer. Really, the learners that we have most of the trouble with are boys who are not the firstborn. Boys' brains grow slower. If you're not the firstborn, that grows slower. So when I said boys are 22 to 32, if the boy's the firstborn child in the family, he's probably closer to 22 when he reaches adulthood. But if you've got a boy who's not the firstborn, he's probably closer to 32. So who's got a boy who's not the firstborn? Yep, so it's good for you to know that they're going to take until they're 32. I have so many adults saying to me they'll have a daughter and then a son. Because I did that. I had a daughter first and then a son. Who did that? A girl and then a boy. Yeah, you shouldn't have done that. Right? According to the literature, we got it all wrong, right? Because if you have a boy first and then a girl, they got one advantage each. The boy gets the firstborn advantage, the girl gets the girl advantage. That evens out the playing field. They tend to reach their milestones at similar times. But if you have a girl first and then a boy, she got both advantages and he got neither. So now they won't reach their milestones at similar times. You'll have a firstborn girl who's 2 and a bit going, "Can I have a drink, please, mummy?" And then the boy you have 2 years later at the same age is going, "Dink, dink, want dink." So you can be left thinking he's a whole lot thicker than his older sister, but in the long run, he could end up having a higher IQ. How quickly you reach your milestones is more to do with your gender and your birth order than it is to do with how bright you are. So just letting you know that when we talk about that frontal cortex coming into full fruition at 27.5, there is quite a lot of density behind that, right? And it's the boys who aren't the firstborn. To be really blunt, most of the prisoners in the country are boys who are not the firstborn. Most of the people who commit suicide are boys who are not the firstborn. Most of the reading recovery class is boys who are not the firstborn. Their brains do grow slower. So I'll have adults saying to me, "I don't know what's wrong with my 23-year-old son. When his older sister was 23, she already had a degree, she'd already travelled around Europe, she was already planning her 2.5 children. He's been raised in the same household with the same parents and the same rules. He's 23, he's just getting stoned and playing PlayStation. So what's gone wrong?" A big part of what's gone wrong there is a boy who's 23, who's not the firstborn, is sort of in the middle of adolescence. He's 9 years short of reaching that frontal cortex to plan for the future, regulate his emotions, whereas your firstborn daughter got it at 18. Okay, I'm going to move on from there because I just wanted you to know there's complexity behind that, right? So brains 1, 2, and 3. Just because the dog has them, don't think they're not important. This is why the neurosequential model is so important, because it's biologically impossible to send messages to brain number 4. The only way you can get to brain number 4 is via brain number 1, via brain number 2, via brain number 3 to get to brain number 4. That's why we're doing this model, right? So the dog's got them, but they're still important. Brain number 1 down the base of your neck is your survival brain. It's called your brain stem, but it keeps your heart beating, keeps you breathing. All right? Just think brain number 1, survival. Brain number 2 in the education model, because their medical model is slightly different. In the education model, brain number 2 is your cerebellum, or your movement brain. So just think brain number 1, survival, brain number 2, movement. If that's all you've got, you're a reptile. That's called the reptilian brain. Literally, your pet lizard's got survival and movement, and that's it. To have brain number 3, which is all the structures in the very centre of the brain, you have to be a mammal. So it's often just called the mammal brain, but its real name's the limbic system, and this is the home of your emotions and your feelings. So quite simply, that means mammals have emotions and feelings that reptiles don't have. If you've got a pet lizard and a pet dog, when you get home from work, you can tell the pet dog's really, really pleased you're home. You can't tell if the lizard is pleased you're home or not. It'll just look at you cold and hard. That lizard can't get excited that you're home because excitement's a limbic emotion which they don't have. And then human beings are not just little frontal cortexes waiting for literacy and numeracy and boundaries and consequences. The only way we can get to those things is going through survival, movement, emotion, and then thinking and learning. Inherently, you all know this model because all human beings develop that way. As in, movement is brain number 2. For none of you was it brain number 1. None of you walked home from the maternity hospital. Undid 100,000 years of evolution and stood up as a baby and walked home. Because movement's brain number 2 for humans. Most of the motor skills you ever learnt in your whole life, you learnt in a 1-year period, actually, between 6 months and 18 months. At 6 months, you're a blob in your parents' arms. 1 year later, that blob in your arms can now walk, crawl, run, climb. All of these flash movements come online. So what are we doing in the first 6 months? We're doing what every creature does first, survival. Because you could be thinking now, well, a horse can get up within a couple of hours and walk. A horse is not more evolved than us. It's not cleverer than us, so why is that? It's really that a horse and a human are doing the same thing when they're born. They're focused on the prime directive, survival. The only difference is the best method horses come up with for survival is running away from his predators. So his legs are ready at birth for his survival method. That means if nature can arrange that for a horse, it can arrange it for us. The reason we don't stand up straight away is basically we've got a way better survival method than running away. Our survival method's called attachment. So we spend the first 6 months convincing someone to fall so madly, deeply in love with us that most of us, by the time we're 6 months old, have someone that would actually literally rather die than let any real harm come to you. So that's way more effective than running away. So human beings aren't born with their legs ready, they're born with things like being able to hold their head still. When they hold their head still, that's quite an advanced adult function, but it's all wired up in the baby's brain because they need to hold their head still so they can lock eye contact onto you. When you lock eye contact, they leak oxytocin and so do you. Oxytocin's the love hormone, and that starts the whole, development. So if I stuck up a picture of a baby now, you would all leak oxytocin. You would see that picture of the baby and go, and it's basically oxytocin. And it's really needed for survival. It's so important that you would do that even for an ugly baby. If I stuck up a picture of a buck ugly baby, you'd still be like, because, it's so important for development. Then around about this age 2 to 7, I'm anchoring you in this neurosequential model because when we give you solutions for what to do in the classroom, you're going to have to go through brain number 1, then brain number 2, then brain number 3 to get to this wonderful stuff in brain number 4. So it's just important you're anchored in understanding that it is the biology of how humans work. We spend the first 6 months doing attachment, 6 to 18 months, all of our motor skills come online. Around 18 months to 2, we move into the emotional brain. We often call this the tantruming 2s, right? But it is the very emotional age. You really stay in that brain as centre stage development until between the ages of 7 and 8. Now that's very consistent with what you learned at Teachers College. Remember Piaget's stages of cognitive development? Remember that concrete operational stage? So Piaget said that you enter the concrete operational stage between 7 and 8, and that's when you're ready for literacy and numeracy. He obviously didn't have brain scans. We're just coming in with brain scans and saying, between 7 and 8 you move up into using that cortex much more, which is much more capable of symbolic thinking and the things we would associate with literacy and numeracy. You can get caught just on this emotional brain, because to be really blunt, the emotional brain is the one that New Zealand screws up a bit. We have the highest rates of suicide for teenagers in the world. We have skyrocketing rates of anxiety and depression. And internationally, we're often seen in our education curriculum as doing brains 1, 2, 4. We skip brain number 3, because this is the brain we associate with play, with creativity, whereas brain number 4 is the one we associate with literacy and numeracy. So we tend to want our 3 and 4-year-olds or our 4-year-olds to start learning to read, because we think it's going to get them ready for school. Whereas what our research has always shown and continues to show is whether a child learns to read at 4 or whether that child doesn't learn to read till 7.5, after the age of 8, no one can tell for the rest of their lives. The child who learns early does not stay ahead. That disappears by the time they're 8. And the child that doesn't start until they're 7:30, until they're 7.5, not 7:30, until they're 7.5, they catch up within 6 months. It doesn't have the big, long benefits that people think. What we have that our parents didn't have is Google in the lounge. We can actually be research informed way more than our parents could. So the cold, hard, depressing fact is that earlier you learn to read, the more chance there is you'll have anxiety and depression as a teenager. Because the earlier you learn to read, the earlier you're bringing on black and white thinking, right and wrong answer, and squashing creativity. Like this is a T. It's a symbol. It's a symbol for the letter T for the T sound. We can't be creative with that and say, let's call it a B and say it makes a Th sound, because that will screw up literacy. So when you introduce literacy early, you are trying to bring online that frontal cortex early. And what you're really doing is failing to meet the needs of the limbic system. What really determines how well you're going to do through the education system is not how early you learn to read, or not how early you learn to write your name, or not how early you learn to write a pencil. There's no research supporting that whatsoever. Over and over again, what you can see in the research is the people who are going to do well in the education system and are more likely to have university degrees and things are the people who experienced a free play environment until the age of 7, a child-led free play environment. Dispositions relates to neuroplasticity, so we can spend some time on it. The key word for brain number 3 for an early childhood teacher really is dispositions. How well you're going to do is, like I say, not the reading, but the dispositions you learn. Dispositions are things like persevering through failure. You can see if someone's going to go through the education system, if they've got a disposition that says, I want to get the answer right the very first time, and if I don't, I'm going to give up, that person's not going to do as well as the person who fails and goes, oh, well, I'll give it another go. Fails, oh, I'll give it another go. Persevering through failure is a key disposition that we've got research for to show that's what actually sets you up for success later on. Persevering through failure. Another disposition is focusing your attention. I just want you to understand that it might seem counterintuitive to think if a kid's just wasting their time playing in a child-led free play environment under 8, and the kid, say, decides to dam the river. Now, there's no subject at primary school called river damming, so you're not preparing him for primary school. But from a disposition point of view, do you think the kid dams the river the very first time he sets about damming the river? No, he probably fails 19 times, and on the 20th time finally dams the river. So from a disposition point of view, you're now developing a child that is learning to persevere through 19 failures and then be successful. When we interrupt play and bring them over to the mat and ask leading questions, what colour is this, what number is this, that does tend to produce very black and white thinkers. It tends to produce a disposition that wants to know, be the best at it straight away and know the answer straight away, or give up and shut down. So you start to see that under 7, adult-led curriculums actually undermine the dispositions that children are going to need to be successful throughout the education system. We sacrifice them for early reading, which our own research shows has no advantage after the age of 8. So basically, early childhood is not supposed to be a little primary school. They're not supposed to be preparing them for primary school. In fact, the 2 first years of primary school probably shouldn't be primary school. It should be completely play-based. We were reviewing the curriculum before COVID, and that looked like it was going to come in, but now that's been put on the backlog because of COVID. But yeah, I'm going to move on because I want to tie all that together with neuroplasticity. Make sure I'm not going way over time. No, sweet. Because, like I said right at the start, all the stuff that you want to engage change in the children, to get them on task, to make them be successful, to get good grades, is all up there in the frontal cortex. But you need to know how to meet the needs of brains number 1, 2, and 3 in order to get to brain number 4. In lots of ways, I don't even have to tell you what to do for brain number 4, because if you do brains 1, 2, and 3 correctly, brain number 4 kind of rolls out of its own accord. So, if we want to achieve neuroplasticity, then we have to use this neurosequential model. We have to go down to the base and look at brain number 1 first. I want to tell you, this is what the literature uses rather than a picture of the brain. It's just 4 brains going up from the bottom to the top. To really get a degree in neuroscience, or to understand, the field of neuroscience, there's 3 fundamental things to understand. One is the power of the first 1,000 days. We haven't really talked about that yet, but I think you've got a vague idea from what I said at the start. The other one is to understand the 4 different brains inside your head, which is what you've just been through. So you've got survival, movement, emotion, thinking and learning. The third and last one is you have to understand the relationship between stress and learning. So this is really important for teachers, right? Which is essentially when we talk about the relationship between stress and learning, we're talking about the relationship between brain number 1, the survival brain, where stress largely comes from, and brain number 4, the cortex, where learning happens. Now, they've got a really complicated relationship. You could do multiple PhDs on the relationship between stress and learning. But to summarise that whole field for you as a teacher, as a practitioner, you can understand all of that by simply putting them on a set of scales. Old-fashioned scales? Scales can't be both up and both down. Scales have to work in relationship to each other. So if you understand that principle of scales, simply put the cortex on one side and the brainstem on the other. And let's just say up is active. So if I want your cortex up here and active, that means I need your brainstem down here and nice and calm. Right now, assumably, your brainstem's quite calm. You had some breakfast, you got food in your belly, you got enough sleep last night, you're not in a war-torn country, no one's shooting at you, so you can have a calm brainstem, you can engage your cortex to listen to me. But it's important to understand that your cortex is not in charge. It's the most recently evolved. Survival's the prime directive. Your brainstem's in charge. Even though the dog's got one, that's in charge. The best way is, like right now, your brainstem's calm, you're engaged in your frontal cortex. If someone suddenly fired a gun at the back of the room now, who thinks they've got the willpower to ignore the shooter and just keep listening to me because they're that fascinated in neuroscience, right? Now, that's what I mean, demonstrating that the cortex is not really in charge. Because when that when that gun goes off and there's a loud bang, you don't have any choice. Automatically, your brainstem takes over in less than a microsecond. In fact, if it's a loud enough bang, most of you, there we go, here's one we prepared earlier, a fire alarm. So, I mean, actually, you can predict a fire alarm because you're in school, so that's not really going to work. But a gunshot, you wouldn't predict. What I'm saying is, boomfa, in less than a second, your brainstem would take over, probably with fight, flight, or freeze. And about, I think it's about 75% of people freeze. Right? But when you work out that, oh no, actually it wasn't a gun firing, it was just a car backfiring, so I'm not in danger, then knowing you're not in danger calms your brainstem down and re-engages your frontal cortex. That's the basics of how learning is in your brain at all times. It means you can't teach a stressed learner. You can't, if a kid arrives at school, there's been a domestic violence scene at home, New Zealand has some of the highest rates of domestic violence, mum's been taken to the refuge, dad's been arrested. If we just launch into teaching that kid to read, you're essentially trying to teach a brainstem to read. If you could teach a brainstem to read, you'd be able to teach a dog to read. You can't teach a brainstem to read. The only part of the brain that's ever going to be able to engage in the curriculum is the cortex. And this is essentially why mindfulness is such an important topic. Because mindfulness is basically an exercise which calms that brainstem down and re-engages the frontal cortex. We often talk about anxiety as worrying about the future, depression's worrying about the past, mindfulness is living in the present moment. Right? So, like I say, the kid comes from a domestic violence home, he's in his brainstem, he gets to class and you do a 5-minute, mindfulness exercise at the start of the day. Now, I'm not going to go through what are mindfulness exercises because you can just do mindfulness exercise into Google and come up with thousands and thousands of them, right? In many ways, Catholic schools have always been doing mindfulness because they started the day with that repetitive prayer and hymns and that routine, kura kaupapa maru have always been doing mindfulness because they start the day with mihi and karakia. Anything that anchors you into the present moment and where you are right now. When you've got to sing the song with everybody else and stay in time with everybody else, that uses your resources, so they're not now worrying about the domestic violence. They're being used in the present moment, so it calms that brainstem down. Actually, the literature is always trying to make it nice and simple. So the trendy method going around now to illustrate that is a method called 6-4-6. 6-4-6, it's that simple. It's simply saying breathe in on the count of 6, breathe out on the count of 4, breathe in on the count of 6. That's a mindfulness technique because basically if you are really in a brainstem state of arousal, your breathing will be irregular. When your ancestors were being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, if we could count their breaths, they would have been going... So it would be going 2, 1, 2, 0, 0, 0, 4, 1. It would be completely irregular, right? So when you use your cortex to override that process and breathe in on the count of 6, breathe in on the count of 4, breathe out on the count of 4, and on the count of 6, it effectively overrides that whole stress response, calms the brainstem down, and brings you into the present moment. Another way of saying this is when your ancestors were being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, what do you think the chances are halfway through the chase they stopped and went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4. No, they didn't, right? Or else they'd be lunch. So by you doing that, it's just a really fast, simple, effective way to communicate to your nervous system that you are not in a state of hyperarousal and to calm it down. Obviously, children are going to need some help with that. If I do controlled breathing with children, I always make sure there's a body action as well, like lifting their arms up as they're breathing and taking them down so that you can see that all the class are participating. Because basically, the kids that need it the most are probably the kids that aren't doing your controlled breathing. So by seeing it with their arms, they are actually participating. Yeah. Actually, singing is another really good example of mindfulness. Again, when your ancestors were being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, what are the chances halfway through the chase they burst into song? They don't, right? In fact, to sing, you have to sort of fill up your lungs, you have to control your breathing. You can't sing when you're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger. So again, singing is something that actually is really effective for calming that whole human stress response system. So if I've got the kids in the morning, I do a mindfulness exercise to calm their brain stems down. I might every 40 minutes go, e tū koutou mo te wāta, and just stand up every 40 minutes and belt out a tūtera mai nā iwi or something, and then they sit down again. That's really going to be biologically respectful to all of their brains and really keep them, really encourage that brainstem to stay calm and that cortex to stay in the driver's seat. Really, to be an expert in brainstems, you normally have to be a trauma expert or a doctor. But to be an expert in brain number 2, the movement brain, you've normally got to be a physio or someone that deals with infant reflexes. Brain number 3, the emotional brain, generally the school counsellor or an early childhood teacher. And then to be an expert in brain number 4, you're a primary school teacher or, because you understand that learning process. But to really implement neuroscience, you've basically got to be a little bit doctor, a little bit physiotherapist, a little bit early childhood teacher or counsellor, and then a little bit primary school teacher. If you had been a trauma expert or a doctor, the 2 key words in the literature, I'm just giving you the cheat sheet, right? I spent years having to siphon through lots of research to get this, but the 2 key words to really understand neuroscience in the brain and the brainstem, brain number 1, the second most important word is predictability. If you're ever in an environment where you can't predict what's going to happen, your brainstem's automatically aroused. So anything you can do as a teacher to enhance predictability is going to calm all of the kids' brainstems. So you might have it up on the board exactly what the timetable is for the day, so the kids know what's happening every half hour. But for the particularly traumatised kid that we know we've got in our class, we've got under his desk another timetable that's showing him what's happening every 10 minutes. Because for that kid, we're trying to really enhance predictability. I saw this when I was lecturing at the university, that firstborn children often take longer to transition to primary school than the other kids. Now that stood out because firstborn children usually do everything faster. So why are they taking longer to transition? And it's really that lack of predictability. The other kids have spent, 2 years coming along to school to pick up their older sibling. They know where the playground is and how to get back to the classroom and where the front gate is. And whereas if the eldest child, kindy visit is the first time they've been to the school, they're overwhelmed by not knowing where the toilet is, where the playground is, how to get back to the front gate. They can't really take on the relationship stuff and the information being told. You see quite clearly in the research, firstborn children transition to school much faster if we take them to school on the weekend when nobody's there and let them get physically orientated in the school. And then when they do the school visit, they've already got a sense of predictability around where they are, right? So, predictability. But the major word for brain number 1 is a dyad. Dyad's a one-on-one relationship. I know we're going to run out of time, so I want to get this whole... I've got 15 minutes though, haven't I? Sweet. So the key number 1 word would be dyad. That's a Greek word meaning a two-way relationship, right? The dyad is the way that the human brain has been growing a frontal cortex since the beginning of time. The frontal cortex is really optional. Even though it's all the good stuff and all the exam results and empathy and all the things we might value, you can basically live a long, long time without empathy. You can live a long, long time without learning to read. You can actually live a long, long time without language. So all of those things, although we value them, are optional. Whereas brains 1, 2 and 3, you kind of die without, so they're compulsory. The number 1 way that human beings have brought online that frontal cortex and calmed the brainstem to allow the cortex to grow is through a dyadic relationship, a one-on-one relationship. So what that means for you in a nutshell is that the children will be more successful if they're anchored into one primary relationship. It's basically, in human development, children need, if I use the female gender, children need a mother and 3 aunties, not 4 aunties. You can't just replace one of the mothers with another auntie and have 4 aunties and think you're going to get the same. You have to have a dyadic, one-on-one relationship that is stronger. You see this in secondary schools now. Because the secondary schools are going, oh, well, you used to be the year 9 dean, you've always been the year 9 dean for 20 years, but next year you're going to be the year 10 dean, and after that you're going to be the year 11 dean, and then the year 12 dean. Now you're following that cohort through, strengthening that dyadic relationship. There's only one person that the parents have to liaise with now all throughout high school, because they just need to know that one teacher. It stops the parents being disengaged. The higher the quality of that relationship, the less chance there is of anxiety, depression, the more in the student, and the more chance there is of on-focus work. So really we have to ask ourselves, why are we changing the teacher every year? That's not a research-based thing. To go, oh, this teacher's good at maths and this teacher's good at music, so we want the kid to have both those teachers, over 2 years, so he's good at maths and music, assumes that your content knowledge is the number 1 most important thing. And it's not. It's very, very clear in the research. The number 1 thing that determines how well that child does in the class is the quality of the relationship with the teacher. So why do we wait until you've built up a quality relationship about term 4 and then go back to the start, do not plus go, do not collect $200 and start the whole process again? So yeah, that's brain number 1. Dyad and predictability are your 2 key words. Everything you can do to enhance the dyadic relationship, that one-on-one, everything you can do to enhance predictability, you're already halfway there in calming the brainstem. Brain number 2, I've said you have to be an expert as a physio. The key word to understand brain number 2 is a thing called rhythmic patterning. So rhythmic patterning is just like it sounds, a steady rhythmic pattern. Now that has to be programmed into the human being. You are not born with a rhythmic pattern already established. It needs to be programmed in by the environment. So despite what you've heard through the media, even if you're black, you're not born with rhythm already established and ready to go, right? It's what we call an epigenetic factor. So you program most of your children with rhythm by doing things like rocking them. No one sat you down in an antenatal class and told you how important it was to rock your baby rhythmically so you could put in a rhythmic pattern, because no one needed to. Have you ever seen anyone rock their baby arrhythmically? No. That's why we don't sit down and tell you in antenatal class. But you were actually, every time you were rocking that baby, you were putting in a rhythmic pattern. When you were winding the baby, you did that rhythmically and were putting in a rhythmic pattern. When you thought you were ignoring the baby and talking to your mate on the phone, you were still putting in place a rhythmic pattern while you ignored the baby. It's so innate to put a rhythmic pattern in. You often see people trying to put a rhythmic pattern into the groceries, in the grocery trolley, and there's no baby in the trolley, but they're still rocking the trolley backwards and forwards. I used to work with the Dunedin Police on a pilot program around if mum had been murdered or nearly murdered and in a domestic violence scene and there were children present, they'd take a child counsellor. So I went out 4 times that year to horrific scenes, but 4 different families. But what did I find most of the children doing at those horrific scenes when I got there? Rocking, yeah. Because your brain will bring about a rhythmic pattern if there's enough cortisol released. Cortisol's a stress hormone. Those kids were so stressed, releasing so much cortisol, that the brain goes into self-defense mode and brings about a steady rhythmic pattern. Because a steady rhythmic pattern from brain number 2 will help to suppress the cortisol release from brain number 1. What we need to do is to make sure that we provide them opportunities to keep that rhythmic pattern steady. If you come from a once were warriors or an abusive home, it's likely that that is arrhythmical. So we get to school and we do a mindfulness exercise, and that helps to bring about a rhythmic pattern and calms the brainstem. Every time we sing and we're using rhythm and being in tune with others, that helps to bring about a rhythmic pattern. If children don't have a rhythmic pattern, they're not going to be able to really access their cortex. There's going to be so much activity happening in brain number 2 with an arrhythmical pattern that you're not going to be able to get up to brain number 4. All the people about 50, about my age, if you went to school in New Zealand, don't worry, you have a rhythmic pattern. Because for the first, if you went to school in the 70s in New Zealand, the first 2 years of school, they inflicted an awful lot of folk dancing on us, right? So there wasn't the same pressure to do literacy and numeracy back then, but if you had an arrhythmical pattern and didn't have a rhythmic pattern, and you're trying to do folk dancing, that soon really stood out, because all those do-si-dos and stuff rely on timing. So a teacher would come alongside that kid and work with them and work one-on-one with them during the folk dancing, and over 2 or 3 weeks that kid would get a sense of rhythm. Ironic that we got rid of folk dancing when we decided to focus on literacy and numeracy, because from what I've just explained to you, a rhythmic pattern is actually a prerequisite to literacy and numeracy. So that folk dancing was actually helping in lots of ways. I want to be clear, I'm not saying bring back folk dancing, that's not the core message, right? But, kapa haka, singing, rhythm in your curriculum, what teachers have always done, the neuroscience is there to really support that. So basically bring singing back to the classroom, embrace that kapa haka. It's not a waste of time, it's not an extra thing, it's really going to help with their emotional brain health and keeping their brain nice and calm. Yeah. So the key word for brain number 1 is dyad and predictability. Key word for brain number 2 is rhythmic patterning. The key word for brain number 3, we already did, is dispositions. Right? Your dispositions. The dispositions you have. So really that's about giving children project-based work. You develop those dispositions when they're in charge of their own work. Okay. I can go on to brain number 4 and tell you about brain number 4, but I want to give you a chance to ask any questions because I know we're going to be running out of time and I want to make it as specific as possible to you. I'm trying to get you to see that with all these kids, a lot of them are going to be traumatised because of COVID. What can you do as a teacher and to calm these kids down, to get through COVID so that we don't have a cohort of kids that are got a massive rates of anxiety and depression and way less achieving? What can you do in your practice? So what you can do is to lower the number of transitions children are having and enhance that dyadic relationship. Especially for the traumatised kids, do they really need to change their teacher? But you can also be doing mindfulness, not just at the start of the day, but maybe every time they come back into the classroom. Don't overcomplicate mindfulness. That could just be as simple as singing. But just bring singing back into the curriculum. That will calm the kids' brain stems. Yeah, and the same with rhythmic patterning. If the kids need a rhythmic pattern, they often try and tell you through their behaviour. The kid that doesn't have a rhythmic pattern is the kid that wants to swing on his chair all the time. You don't need to swing on your chair because you've got an internalised sense of rhythm. You don't need to have actual physical rhythm to concentrate. But ironically, that kid is probably concentrating and listening to you much better because he's allowed to swing on the chair. Because it's helping him to establish a rhythmic pattern. Kids often, working with traumatised kids, often kids that don't have a rhythmic pattern want to chew chewing gum all the time. Because again, chewing gum gives them a steady rhythmic pattern. So yeah, just think about that in terms of the opportunities that the kids have in the class. There's a whole lot of research to show if you take the chairs out and put in Swiss balls, there's a whole lot of more on-task behaviours. Because now the children can sit on the Swiss ball, regulating their rhythmic patterning, and will actually focus a whole lot more on what you're saying. Okay, before I go into brain number 4, do you want to ask some questions? Anyone? Yep, go for it. Yep. Move your mask down a wee bit, because my hearing's a bit... Yep, we do. So we see that the fastest growing group of kids that seem to have anxiety and depression are girls. It's harder to get the firstborn information. They don't, take statistics as much as possible. So I can't say that conclusively, but it looks to be that they're the at-risk group. Yep, absolutely. Because you see, boys are the ones falling behind girls in the education system, and the boys are the ones that fill the suicide statistics, but the anxiety and the depression, especially anxiety statistics, seem to be filled by girls. Mm-hmm. Parents often ask me, especially if you're a teacher, we're often the worst at introducing literacy and numeracy early because that's what our job is as a primary school teacher. So, I was a primary school teacher before I was an early childhood teacher, and I had all those same ideas. But yeah, if we've encouraged that black and white thinking, and now you've got this, little girl that wants to be the best at it the very first time, and if she's not, she gives up, and she seems to need to be the best and has low self-esteem when she's not. You think, oh no, I've inadvertently, encouraged this black and white thinking and set her up for anxiety and depression. What can you now do to undo that? So basically, you need to take her away from right and wrong answers and start dancing in the grey rather than the black and white. So don't sit at the table and play quiz games of what's the capital of Fiji, because that has one right answer. Instead, have conversations at the table like, what does the tooth fairy actually look like? Because there's no right answer to that. I say that one because we had a fascinating conversation at my table. I just thought everybody thought the tooth fairy was blonde and little ballerina thing with a wand. But apparently not everybody sees the tooth fairy like that. I must have just seen some image in my early childhood that said that, and that formed the archetype in my mind. Because I found out my 6-year-old daughter thinks the tooth fairy is a 6-foot-tall Samoan. Because the first time she saw the tooth fairy, it was the Rock. So she just assumed that all tooth fairies look like that. So it led to a language-rich conversation, and it's getting the children away from that black and white, right-wrong answer thinking. Yeah. That's basically what you do. The best thing I've found for undoing it is theatre sports. Theatre sports, whose line is it anyway? That does the exact opposite to right-wrong thinking because you just have to immediately go without thinking. Theatre sports goes, okay, you've got to sing a song using the country and western style about your mother eating baked beans in the shower, go. And you just have to go, mum's eating baked beans in the shower, you have to think of it as you go. So that's the exact opposite to that black and white thinking. So if you're worried about the children who've got to black and white thinking, enroll them in theatre sports. Yeah. Any other questions? You can interrupt me if you do have a question, because I'd rather take a question from you, but I've got a few minutes, so I just want to talk about brain number 4. I told you the key practices for brain number 1 is dyad, basically, and predictability. Key word for brain number 2 is rhythmic patterning. Key word for brain number 3 is dispositions. The key word for brain number 4 is executive functions. So executive functions are the things that underpin your higher intelligence. And we know executive functions are, they're not crystallised, they're fluid. So our parents used to think they were crystallised. Our parents thought your intelligence was crystallised. They thought if you were a thick 14-year-old, you were probably a thick 4-year-old and you'd be a thick 40-year-old, because once you're thick, you're always thick. But we know now that intelligence is actually fluid. Your intelligence levels can be changed by enhancing the executive functions. Now, if you put executive functions into Google, you'll get 65 or something. But essentially, if you know these 4, you understand the executive functions. One is working memory. So working memory is the number of balls you can juggle in your head at one time. So if I say to you, remember the numbers 17 and 19. Now that's without writing them down. Now that's not difficult. That doesn't tax your working memory very much. You don't need any strategies. You can just sit the numbers there in your head, and you can. If I say now what were the numbers, you can just retrieve them, because that only requires a working memory of 2. If I say remember those 2 numbers without writing anything down, but also remember the numbers 53 and 37. So now I'm asking you to remember 4 numbers. That taxes your working memory a bit more. Most of you have had to employ a strategy. Most of you have employed repetition. You're repeatedly saying those 4 numbers over so that you can remember them, right? Yeah, so working memory turns out to be an executive function. In the maths class, the bottom maths class typically have a working memory of 2. The middle maths class have a working memory of around 4. And the top maths class have a working memory of around 6. So that technically means you can take a kid out of the bottom maths class, take them over here, do nothing but work on working memory, and that can just be like playing the memory card game. You saw your own kids develop their their memory, because when they were first playing memory, they only had a working memory of 1. They had an ace, and they just spent the whole game looking for that ace. They go past 4 kings, they don't care because they're looking for an ace, they've got a working memory of 1. And then gradually they can be looking for an ace and looking for a 10 at the same time. Now they've got a working memory of 2. So you can take a kid from the bottom maths class, be doing those exercises, and a term later assess him and he's in the top, because he's got a working memory of 6, and that's what really powers your ability to do maths and be successful at maths. Another one is cognitive flexibility. This is what we colloquially call, what do you say mum can do that dad can't do? Multitasking, that's right. So cognitive flexibility is the academic way of saying multitasking, because humans don't really multitask. Otherwise, when mum was on the right-hand side of the brain going, go All Blacks, and then she jumped to the left-hand side of the brain and separated the whites from the colours and put the sewing machine on. The washing machine on. See, I didn't even know what it's called. Right? And they put the washing machine on. She would, if it was really multitasking, we would see activity in both sides of the brain at once. But we don't. We see mum on the right-hand side of the brain going, go All Blacks. The ads come on. She jumps across this bridge in the middle of the brain called the corpus callosum, and she goes to the left-hand side of the brain and gets the instructions for the washing machine. Then she jumps back across the corpus callosum, across this bridge, to the right-hand side of the brain to go All Blacks. Now, women have a much more detailed corpus callosum and a larger corpus callosum than men do. That's probably why we associate women with multitasking, right, or cognitive flexibility. Humour me and just say the words to the song. Your brain's learnt the words to up to 1,000 songs without even trying. So just humour me and say, bye bye Miss American Pie. Drove my Chevy to the levee, but the levee was dry. Singing, good old boys, what's 8 times 4? Yeah, see, that's cognitive flexibility, because you're in the right-hand side of your brain reciting poetry you didn't really consciously know the words to, but what do you know? You do actually know the words as they come. That's a very right brain thing. And then I went to a very specific left brain. There's only one right answer to 8 times 4. So the people that were able to drove my Chevy to the 32, you've got very good cognitive flexibility, right? That will set you up well. All the people still currently singing Bye Bye Miss American Pie, you might want to work on your cognitive flexibility, right? So working memory, cognitive flexibility, metacognition. Metacognition is basically knowing yourself as a learner. If you were like the 70-something% of university students that left their essay to the last minute in the last 48 hours, let's make it that you've left the essay to the last 24 hours. Who's going to stay up late and do an all-nighter and just work into the, all night, or work into the early hours of the morning and wait until it's finished at 4 a.m. and then go to bed and then get up and hand it in at 9? Who's a nighttime essay writer? Hands up. Who's more like me and will set the alarm for 3:30 in the morning and get some sleep first and get up at 3:30 and do it to hand it in at 9? Neither of them is right or wrong. That's just metacognition, that you know. The more you know your brain, the more intelligent you are. If I didn't have any metacognition, I'd have kept writing my essays at night time, the night before, and got C's. Whereas if I did the same hours but did it in the morning, I'd get a B. It's hard to get an A when you're only doing it in 5 hours, right? But just that recognition, the same amount of work gets a higher grade. Metacognition is one of the executive functions. The other and most important executive function, because those three are second equal really, the one that stands out head and shoulders in the literature as being the most important is self-control. The ability to control yourself, which is quite bad news for New Zealanders because we're quite into external control. Shut up and do as you're told. But the more externally controlled you are, the less self-control you have. I know I've got to finish, but you can start to encourage self-control, when they're 2, by saying, oh, it's snowing outside today, mate. Would you like to wear your green jersey or your blue jersey? That's already encouraging self-control. You don't say to a 2-year-old, oh, it's snowing outside today, mate. What would you like to wear to Early Childhood Centre? Because he will choose Spider-Man togs. And you can't wear Spider-Man togs to the centre, right? So that's too much choice for a 2-year-old. But simply saying, put your blue jersey on because it's cold, is already squashing that ability for self-control. So there you go, a challenge for you as teachers in New Zealand for how can you get the kids in the class to exercise as much self-control. Are they involved in the rule making of the class and how the class runs? Because the more they're involved in that, the more self-control they have. Okay, right, I've reached the end. That's given you a crash course in neuroplasticity. You've got a fairly good understanding of the 4 substances you've got to avoid and that neurosequential model, and then some tips on what you can do in your practice at each one of those brain levels to make your job easier, basically. When you have got a difficult job, you had a difficult job anyway before COVID, but now you really have to be kind of a social worker and a counsellor before you can really get to that art of teaching. So hopefully that helps and empowers you to do that. Kia ora koutou. Thanks everybody. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan, for that incredible talk. What stood out to me was that we are not stuck in our ways, but we are often stuck in our thoughts, and we can change the way we think, as well as that important relationship, the dyad relationship between the teacher and the student. There is no doubt about the need to do all that we can to teach these well-being practices and strategies in order to help ourselves, each other, and our tamariki. It is often just the how that challenges us. Just hit the clicker, sorry. There we go there. Oh, we've got lots of slides. There we go. Fortunately, there are already so many wonderful programs and resources at our fingertips, designed by experts who are passionate in this field. And we are very grateful to have representatives from these organisations here today to demonstrate to you in our next session what you could be doing, or rather what you should be doing in your classrooms and in your schools. So we would like to thank the facilitators from the following organisations for coming in to share their wellbeing programs and resources with us, and for making the complexities of teaching the many aspects of wellbeing so much easier and accessible. Nathan has kindly agreed to just hang around during morning tea to answer any questions that you may have. But Nathan, please accept this small gift of appreciation from us with much thanks, and we wish you all the best with the incredible and motivational work that you do. So kia ora. Thank you so much. Lovely to Incidentally, Nathan will be back in our neighbourhood on the 13th of June. He's doing a talk at Westlake Boys, and you can get tickets to that. It's on the Teenage Brain on Event Finder. So we'd like you all now to join us, if you ignore the cats session. We're all in need of some caffeine. To join us for morning tea, and just a reminder that then we'll start our session 2 at 11 o'clock. Just to let you know, in terms of predictability, we are going to ask you to just make your way to the classrooms on the outside of the building, but if you are in any sessions in the back of the hall room, the access point is just to my left over here. Have a great time. Thanks.